There are some spells in D&D 5th edition that just should not be in the game, whether encroaching on certain design niches or just being a headache for most DMs and parties. These are 13 spells I would be okay with if the designers of D&D 5th edition just tossed out. And before I actually start, this isn't a list of the most powerful spells that need to be reworked, or spells that I have a problem with in my games. I think these are just spells for various reasons that should not have been created. These spells just being in the game limit what D&D 5th edition can be. Now, if you've played high-level D&D, my first two spells should not be surprising. Wall of Force and Force Cage are two nightmare spells. These two spells essentially create indestructible bubbles of magic that cannot be dispelled and can completely shut down combats if you're not careful. Force Cage in particular is egregious. It doesn't even require concentration, and you can't even try and teleport out of the Force Cage without risking a charisma save. But Wall of Force being a 5th level spell means that if your D&D party is ending at about 10 or 11th level, your spellcasters are going to get access to this bomb. Now, can you DM around both of these spells? Absolutely. But they're a pain, and they're a boring pain at that. If you get put inside one of these indestructible bubbles as a player, what are you supposed to do? If you're a marshal, you're doing jack shit, unless you have access to some sort of teleportation ability. And if you're a DM and you don't constantly take into account that a player could have one of these spells, well, your tough boss fight could be turned into an absolute joke in seconds. I'm all for having powerful spells, but there's no counterplay or interesting mechanics at work with Wall of Force or Force Cage. And honestly, I don't think either spell would be missed. The next two spells on the list I have also grouped together, but they're probably not on the list for the reasons that you might think. I'm talking about the spells Conjure Animals and Animate Objects. Summoning in D&D 5th edition is powerful, yes. I don't think it's as powerful as Reddit would have you believe. D&D combat doesn't happen in a vacuum, and eventually having resistance to non-magical damage and enemies having AoEs consistently or auras will drastically reduce the effectiveness of these spells, and not to mention that these spells are also concentration. So by just attacking the caster, all the summons also go away. But I'm not looking to talk about those aspects because that's not why I have a problem with these spells. D&D 5th edition has a pace of combat problem. Combat can become a slog for a lot of DMs and players. Turns can take a long time, especially past 5th level. So when you start adding more creatures to the initiative, and by adding more rolls to the combat, you're going to grind the pace of play down even more. If you're the person summoning these animals or animating these objects, the experience will be passable. You'll do some damage, move some minis around the battlefield, and it will be fine. It's not that exciting, but it's fine. Everyone else at the table, though, might grow to loathe these spells, because already it's hard to pay attention to combats when it's not your turn, especially when that time can be 20, 30, 40 minutes until your next turn. But when you have to sit there and wait as wolf number 3 makes another attack and it misses, and then you go to wolf number 4, it just gets to be a mess. I'm completely okay with the summoning spells because in most instances it doesn't add more rolls to a combat. The spellcaster is basically just giving their turn to the summoned entity. But in my experience, Conjure Animals and Animate Objects can just be annoying, and I'd be okay if they went out the window. My next spell, though, I think is a little controversial. I think the game would be perfectly fine if Pass Without Trace was removed. Here's the deal, if you have a caster or a ranger in your party and they have Pass Without Trace, all stealth checks are fine forever. As a dungeon master, that design space for stealth missions becomes a lot smaller. A +10 to an entire party's stealth checks for an hour for only a 2nd level slot, that's insane. And maybe you could rework this spell so that it's a higher level spell, like 5th, 6th, 7th level. But this spell is still encroaching on what the marshals are supposed to do best. I want classes like the rogue, the monk, or the ranger to really shine during stealth operations. Pass Without Trace is a really good spell, but it's still limiting the design of what the designers and a party can do. I don't think this spell completely negates the need for a rogue, a monk, or a ranger, but it chips into their niche unnecessarily. And I think the game would be better if the designers of Wizards of the Coast would just throw it by the wayside. I think the same is true with the shield spell. This small spell, which gives a +5 to an AC, is good in theory. As a spellcaster, you're trying to boost your already tiny AC to prevent yourself from being hit. But if you've played at a power gaming table, or you've been playing D&D 5th edition since its inception, you know how easy it is to break the game with the shield spell. I'm not going to get into bounded accuracy as a concept right now, but high level 40,000 foot view increases to AC are incredibly powerful due to the way D&D 5th edition is designed, allowing entire builds to get a +5 to their AC for an entire round is game-breaking in some instances. Spellcasters already have many defensive options. Mirror Image, Blur, or Sanctuary are all low-cost options to keep a spellcaster safe, and I'm not even against AC boosts. Shield of Faith gives a +2 to your AC and is a concentration spell. The boost isn't so high that it's game-breaking, it's concentration so that you can break the Shield of Faith, and you have to use your bonus action to use it. So if you're a spellcaster, that's going to eat up your 1 leveled spell for your turn. The shield spell can just be a headache. And again, as a DM, I can just increase the to-hit ratings on all my monsters or use more saves. But hey, I'm an experienced DM, I know the game. A newer DM, I'm not going to expect to get all this information right away. And in a party where everyone is running shield spells all the time, this could completely break their combat balancing. And B, this is just another encroachment on what martials are supposed to do well. I am completely okay with the fighter having a 22 AC and being the tank of the party. It does feel weird though when the wizard has a 23 AC on demand and defensive spells. I just think shield can get rather silly, so I'd be okay with it getting tossed. Next up though is another pair of 2 spells that I think almost single-handedly killed exploration and survival campaigns in D&D 5th edition. I'm talking about the spells Goodberry and Create Food and Water. The ability for spellcasters to create food in such a way that the party never has to worry about it can kill a campaign if part of the core concept of that is scrounging around for food and resources. The point of the ranger class is to guide parties through the wilderness. They are supposed to be the best at navigating, at foraging, at scouting. But when you remove the need to worry about food or water, well then you're just left with the dangers of the wild. And any class has tools to deal with random encounters and enemies coming after them. So I think it was a mistake to put these spells in 5th edition. Now importantly, I don't think water creation spells or water destruction spells are that bad at all. Water is a tool that can be used in dungeons. Water is also something that's not very interesting to look for. In the context of 5th edition, it boils down to a simple ability check. And when you get to the water, you just drink it. Plus, many of the create water spells don't create enough water for a group for a day with one cast. If you're in a desert survival campaign and the spellcasters are needing to burn 2, 3, 4 spell slots in order to keep the party hydrated every day, I think that's more than fair. But I don't see any reason to add in a first level spell like Goodberry. I mean seriously, it's a first level spell that doesn't even consume its components, and provides enough nourishment for 10 creatures for a day plus a hit point. Seriously, how did this spell get through testing? I still don't know. The next spell though is another that limits the design space for DMs, and that's the spell Comprehend Languages. I think Comprehend Languages removes so much of the importance around choosing languages in D&D 5th edition. This first level spell, which you get at level 1, allows you to communicate with any creature you run across or to read any text for the remainder of your adventure. And it's a ritual spell, so you don't even need to have it prepared. I've seen more than once a newer DM give a book or a line of text to a party written in a language nobody understood, and the whole premise was to somehow find a person to decipher that language to figure out what it means. And then one of the players raises their hand and says, I have Comprehend Languages. I want to read it and see what it says. And then the DM goes, oh yeah, it was infernal. It says blank. I think spells that allow for parties to bypass interesting situations to little or no cost for them are badly designed spells. At least you have a spell like Knock that creates a loud noise within 300 feet of the location. At least with a spell like Knock, there is a cost to using the spell, and you are not instantly killing that design space. But with Comprehend Languages, again, you don't even need to have the spell prepared. 5th edition has a lot of hand wave spells that allow for players to easily solve problems. And those hand wave spells, I think for a lot of parties, help contribute to the martial caster divide. Can you overcome this divide? Absolutely. That's probably the sequel video after this, how I run my game so that martials are equal to casters. And if you want proof of that, you can check out this video up here where you can see how some of my players value martials way more than casters. And that's just because of how I run my games. But I don't think some groups would be running into such a divide if you got rid of spells like comprehend languages. Cause for most, martials still feel like they have their place in combat. But why the hell would I play a mastermind rogue or take the linguist feat when comprehend languages exists? Next up though, let's talk about, I think, another controversial spell on this list. Let's get rid of Revivify, at least on spell lists. Look, past 5th level, unless you're homebrewing your game to make Resurrection more difficult, no D&D character should ever die. As long as there's a character that knows Revivify and has a diamond worth 100 gold pieces, all the characters in the party are basically safe. The actual threat of death is very, very small. This is not saying that there should be no resurrection magic. I think that would be insane. Nor am I saying that Revivify should be completely taken out of the game. This is a bit of a more nuanced take that Revivify should be removed from the spell lists of all classes. If you want Revivify as part of an item, or a scroll, or some other class ability like the lore bard that allows you to choose any spell, I'm good with that. Because then there is still that option to give players that safety net. And I don't even run deadly games. In more than 10 years, I've had 2 TPKs out of more than 30 campaigns. But I even think that the threat of death being removed 25% of the way through progression is kind of absurd. So let's just get Revivify out of there. The next spell though should not be controversial if you've played high level Dungeons & Dragons. Simulacrum is game breaking. The ability for spellcasters to make a second version of themselves and create a second initiative is kind of insane. No, it's not kind of insane, it is insane. What were you doing, Wizards of the Coast? The number of game-breaking combos that a player can gain access to if they take Simulacrum is possibly infinite. And I say this because this duplicate of yourself never goes away. It lasts until it is dispelled, or it is destroyed. But let's be honest here, if you are a mage with access to 7th level spells, you can keep that Simulacrum pretty well protected. And yes, it costs 1,500 gold pieces to make this Simulacrum. But again, if you are part of a high-level D&D party, this is a drop in the bucket. This is going to be barely noticeable for most parties. And I realize that the Simulacrum has a few weaknesses, mainly that it cannot regain spell slots. But the weaknesses are so minimal compared to the game-breaking potential that I almost don't even register them. But I also want to take a step back from the DM position and look at the player position. Because if you're a player, is Simulacrum that fun to use, or is it optimal? Now, spells can be both optimal and fun to use. I'm looking at you, Fireball. However, I'd argue that Simulacrum with its effects is kinda boring. And if you're in a group with a spellcaster that has a Simulacrum, combat is slowing down for you in most instances because one player is basically getting 2 turns. There are just a ton of problems with Simulacrum. And again, since most players are not reaching higher level D&D, they don't interact with this spell anyway. I think you could toss the spell out tomorrow and barely anybody would care. This next spell though is a spell that is beloved by players, but I think should also, in the same vein as Revivify, be removed from the spell list that all spellcasters can get. I am talking about the Wish spell. Wish is obviously the best spell in the game, and there's not even a debate about it. If you get to 17th level and you have the ability to take the Wish spell, you are going to take the Wish spell. If you do not, what are you doing? It kills the design space for 9th level spells because you always have to ask, do I want this spell or do I want Wish? Because I love spells like Invulnerability, but would I ever take Invulnerability over Wish? Hell no. Let Wish be reserved for certain items like the Ring of 3 Wishes or for genies, because so many times when you're reaching these epic tiers of play, the game will need to stop because as soon as a player gets access to the wish spell, it's kinda all over. Now you can just end the campaign, because you and your party can warp reality. I mean, you already could in some ways warp reality before that, but this is the power of a god. So I would humbly submit removing the wish spell from all spell lists for players, and leaving it like Revivify for items, for creatures, and for other entities. Before we start talking about the last spell though on this list, I want to give some honorable mentions, powerful spells that I would not remove. Hypnotic Pattern is a powerful spell, no question about it, but it has some redeeming qualities. It requires a wisdom save. Creatures who are immune to the charm condition are not affected by it. Other creatures not affected can wake up their comrades. It still gives marshals the ability to go in and take out the incapacitated creatures. Oh, and Hypnotic Pattern is concentration, so you can just attack the person that cast Hypnotic Pattern. Is it still incredibly strong? Yes. I'd honestly change the spell so that the creatures are incapacitated until the end of your next turn. But there's enough good with the spell that I just wouldn't throw it out. The same is true for spells like Polymorph and Fireball. Polymorph is a fantastically fun spell to use and is great utility. I think the problem comes when you're trying to target enemies with the spell, because then you can completely remove the threat of some combats. Even now though, as a DM, I can plan around Polymorph in combats. For some parties, I plan in a Polymorph inside that combat. The party just has X more effective hit points. So I'm not really quaking in my boots over this spell, but I understand how other DMs could really be annoyed by Polymorph, and I'd really like it to be reworked a bit in future editions of D&D. I mean, in the past we had Baleful Polymorph when targeting enemies. I think the same logic is also true with Fireball. If you are a new DM and you do not know how to deal with AoE in Dungeons & Dragons, Fireball is going to be a huge problem for you, especially because if you just keep on sending clumps of fodder at your party and the wizard is going to keep on casting Fireball, they are going to far out damage any other party member. Honestly, the spell probably needs a decrease to its damage and its radius of effect. But Fireball is such an iconic piece of D&D history that I would never suggest outright removing it. And then I have a whole list of other powerful spells that, again, while powerful, I don't want to remove. Spellcasters should have powerful spells that draw you to those classes. I would never want to touch spells like Haste, or Fly, or Teleport. And a spell like Teleport actually for me falls into a category of spell that I like to call party spells. Yes, the caster has that spell, but it's party utility. The party is thankful they have that capacity because that's your job, caster. If you can warp reality, teleport us to the city, please. I want to play regular dude fighter. It doesn't really fit my fantasy to be teleporting to that city. That's your job, King. That's not my job. The same thing is true for a spell like Sending. I want my sorcerer to cast Sending as a rogue to let our allies know that they're about to be attacked. Yes, I'm a rogue. Yes, I might have access to a network of thieves that gives me information, but it breaks the fantasy if I have an ability that instantly lets me telecommunicate with creatures across this plane of existence. Please, spellcasters, take that role, it's yours. The same thing is true for pretty much all teleportation spells or all divination spells. If you have a buff spell, great, keep it. But I think sometimes the discourse with these spells turns to they are too powerful because this is something a spellcaster can do that a marshal cannot do. But I do not want a marshal to be able to do everything. I want the marshal to fit the marshal fantasy. If, as a player, I wanted a character that could bend reality, I would be playing a spellcaster. But that does not mean that I, as a marshal, should not have my place in a party. This entire list, I think, is made up of spells that encroach on certain niches of the game or exclude certain design spaces. So if you're in the comments talking about why didn't I mention this powerful spell, it might be because, well, A, it might be powerful, but I still think the effect should be in the game. Or B, it's really not that powerful. Seriously, there are just certain spells the D&D community thinks is amazing that when you actually start playing the game long term, you're like, it's fine. The spell isn't broken or anything. And that's what makes Silvery Barbs so hilarious to me, the final spell we're going to talk about, because it is just that broken. Silvery Barbs might have an argument for the most powerful first level spell ever created. I think it certainly holds that title in D&D 5th edition right now. Not only are you harming an opponent not on your turn, but you are aiding an ally on whatever their next roll is. Not only are you double dipping on one spell, but it is so antagonistic towards the DM or towards your players when you're using Silvery Barbs. A first level reaction spell that can sometimes read make an enemy fail, make your ally succeed is way too strong, and I think as a core concept is fundamentally broken. Now if you want to hear me talk about how we might be able to fix this spell, check out this video right here. Also, if you haven't already, consider joining the Patreon. We've got free homebrew content, shoutouts, and so much more over there. And thank you for entering the dungeon.